Okay, so at this point, we've successfully protected all of our server's routes using Firebase admin, and we've made sure that users can only access and modify information that they own. Now, there's still one problem with our server, and it's something that you probably picked up on as we were typing this out, and that is that our code is extremely repetitive. So if you take a look at what we're doing here, right, where we're getting the auth token, we're basically verifying the auth token inside this try catch block, and we're sending back certain status codes depending on the result of that. And then, if we scroll down to our update and delete endpoints, you can see that the code here is exactly the same thing. Now, you might be wondering, is there a way that we can avoid this repetition by, encapsulating this logic somehow? And the answer to that, I'm happy to say, is yes. So essentially what we're going to do here is add something called express middleware. Middleware are basically functions that get called for several different endpoints, right? So in other words, right now, we have our server here, and we have our endpoints here, we'll just say. And incoming requests get handled by our server, and they get passed directly to each of the endpoints, depending on the URL. All right, so what middleware basically allows us to do is define extra nodes in between the basic server and our endpoints that allow us to do things like data processing. So what that ends up looking like instead is we have our server here, and we can have middleware here in between our server and our endpoints, and then we have our endpoints out here, and we're able to define which endpoints certain middleware applies to, right? So we might have just one for this one, and this might go straight to this endpoint. So we're able to kind of create these chains of processing, if you will, with Express middleware. So let me show you what this is going to look like. Essentially, whenever we want to add middleware to an Express server, all we have to do is just use the app.use function that's provided to us by our Express server. And just to give you an example here, I'm going to say app.use. And basically what we do is we pass a single callback to this function, which takes the request and response arguments the same as any other Express endpoint. And additionally, it takes an argument called next, which is basically a function that this callback can call to tell Express that it's ready to go on to whatever the next middleware is, or it's ready to pass off control to the route handler. So you'll see what I mean in just a second here, but essentially what we can do, if we were to say console.log and say something like received a request inside here, and then call next, what would happen is basically anytime our server received a request, we would see this received a request thing logged out to the console, right? And then the rest of our server would behave exactly like it has before. Just to show you what this might look like, right? We're just going to open up our server terminal. We're going to try logging in here just so we can load some data. I'm just going to log in as sean@gmail.com. Click login. And what we'll see is that as we load that data, we see that it says received a request. If we refresh this again, we'll see that logged out to the console again. If we do something like edit our account data and click Save Changes, we'll see that we got 2 requests, right? One, or actually 3 now. One from when we actually went to the edit account page and loaded that data. One for when we clicked Save Changes and made that request to the server. And one from when we went back to the home page and reloaded that data. Okay, so that's the basics of how middleware works, and I mention it in a course about Firebase Auth because middleware is the key to reducing unnecessary repetition when it comes to authentication. So essentially, all of this repeated code that we've been using in our endpoints, all this try, catch, blah, 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 we can actually create an endpoint that will take care of that for us. So essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to delete this code that we have here now, and we're going to put the shared code, right, all the code that's shared by our server endpoints into this express middleware function that we're creating. Now that's going to be auth token. We're going to use that one in all of our endpoints. we're going to use the try catch block in all of our endpoints. So I'll paste that here. Oops, there we go. And once we have that inside our middleware, all we have to do is call next. And that will basically perform all of these checks for us. And, it'll take care of sending back an error status code if something's wrong. And once it's done that, it will turn over control to whatever endpoint the user is actually making a request to. Okay, and now that we've done all that, all we need to do is go through all of our endpoints and remove that try catch logic. So I'm just going to remove this same thing here. Oh, and actually the create user endpoint is going to be a little different. So we'll want to leave that try catch block in there. I'll come back to that in a minute. For our update function, we're going to want to delete this as well, since that's exactly the same. And for our delete endpoint, we're going to do that as well. So we'll delete that like that. Okay, and we can also get rid of this auth token thing in both of these. And now let's go back up to our create endpoint. Basically, this one doesn't need the middleware, and in fact, the middleware will block it from happening. So in cases like these, where we only want middleware to apply to a subset of our endpoints, there's a few things we can do. One thing would be to just take this route and put it above where we defined the middleware, right? That would be fine. The other thing is that we can actually define the exact routes that we want our middleware to apply to. So what we can do for that, we can say app.use, and since all of the routes that we want this middleware to apply to have basically the same URL, which is /users/user ID, all we need to do is add that there, and that means that when this create endpoint is called, basically the middleware won't be applied to it. And I was just checking my terminal here. It looks like we forgot an async somewhere. What we're going to do is, yes, we just need to add it to our middleware function. And it looks like I just need to restart my server in general. That can happen sometimes with Node daemon. And one more thing that we have to do here is up in our app.use middleware, we need to actually get this user ID because right now it would be undefined. So all we're going to do is say const user ID equals request.params. So let's go back here now and test out our app by refreshing it. And we should see that we have the same Sean Wassell and I like to program. If we try editing it, those changes should be reflected. And I'm not going to try deleting it now, but feel free to try deleting and creating an account on your own. Now, one more thing that we can use middleware for on our server currently is this 404 status code. Basically, just like we were doing up at the top, we're doing pretty much the same thing for most of our server endpoints, right? For our get endpoint, for our put endpoint, we're doing that. For our delete endpoint, we're doing that. Basically, all we want to do is send back a 404 status code if there's not currently a user with that ID in our database. So what we can do for that, we can either add that logic to our existing Express middleware, or we can create a new middleware. I'm just going to create a new one here. For that, we're going to use the same URL as we did up here. We're going to say /users/user ID. We're going to say async request response and next. And inside here, we're just going to try and get the user with that ID from our database. So we'll say const user ID equals request.params. We're going to see if there's a user with that ID by saying const user equals users user ID. And then we're just going to say if the user doesn't exist, we want to say return response.sendStatus 404. All right, so that'll just protect all of our endpoints in the case of 404s, and that will allow us to remove this 404 send status thing from all of our endpoints. So we no longer need to check for a user since we know it exists. And in fact, what you can do in order to avoid duplicating this logic here is you can just say else, and you can say request.user equals user, right? Basically, Express allows us to set properties on this request object that can then be accessed down in our endpoints. So we're going to want to call next after that as well. And what we can do now is we don't even have to get the user ID or the user. We can just say response.json request.user. We'll skip our create endpoint here because that one doesn't play by the same rules. Down here in our app.put, what we're going to do, we're still going to get the request body, but we don't need the user ID and we don't need the user. And we also don't need to check if the user exists because we know they already do. Going to adjust the indentation here. Oh, and we actually are going to keep the user ID thing up at the top. So let's, we don't need this user thing here though. We don't need this if statement. We don't need this else statement. And then we just need to change this spread operator to request.user. And everything else should be the same. So last but not least, let's do our delete endpoint. We're going to remove this if statement here and the else statement. Just going to adjust the indentation there. And we don't need this user here either. We're just going to say response.json request.user. And that should be all we need to do. So let's just make sure we didn't mess up any of the syntax. It looks like our server is running correctly. And if you want to go through and check each of those endpoints, feel free to do so. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.